My name is Matthew Gomez, and I want to introduce you to a country called Peru. I see that you're interested in to study abroad there. I find the country very fascinating. I was actually born in Peru. The large part of my family's from there, particularly my father's side, and I've visited the country a number of times myself as a tourist since I was a baby. But since the last 15 years or so, I've heavily focused, as well as my own studies as a student, but also as an instructor. I am an instructor here at Florida International University. I teach mainly politics. I also teach a little about history, heavily focused in Latin America. And I always try to use like Peru as an example in my class, mainly because Peru is in many ways like been kind of skewed the last few years. Last few decades, particularly with the rise of social media, the internet. Not as many people know too much about the country that they really think. There's certain aspects that you probably may have heard about, either positive or negative. But I kind of want to get a little bit more in detail, a little bit more about what the country is about and what are certain aspects that you will notice, particularly when you visit the country. Again, Peru is like one of those countries that I love very much, and I always believe people should heavily go visit and study, particularly as a student. This little info about Peru is kind of split into two sections. The first focuses a little bit more about the basic culture, while the second deals with certain specific issues which you may come across as a visitor, particularly if you've never visited Peru before, or if you've never visited South America or Latin America in general. First, Peru is almost like three countries in one. The nation is split into three regions. The coast, which is usually called La Costa, along the Pacific Ocean, La Sierra, which is the Andes mountain region, and La Selva, which is the Amazon jungle. Although the jungle takes up over 60% of the territory, it's only home to roughly about 5% of the population. The majority of the populations of Peruvians live on the coastal areas, including the capital city, which is called Lima, which has roughly a little over 10 million people in the metro area. You are likely to visit Lima mainly to get to Cusco because there are no direct flights from the United States to Cusco. You usually need to fly via Lima, unless you actually visit Lima specifically, but you will be going through there mainly through the airport. Cusco, the city you're likely to spend the most time in, is located in La Sierra in the mountains of the Andes, and it's actually considered the second largest city in the region with about 300,000 people, following a city in southern Peru called Arequipa. Peruvians themselves are a mixture of many different ethnic groups. There's no dominant group overall, though mestizos do tend to be the majority, which are mixed Native American indigenous. But you also have indigenous groups, whites, Africans, and Asians. The last one, not as many people know about, but Peru is actually home to the largest Asian population in Latin America. Actually, my own ancestry is partly Chinese as well. But within Cusco itself, the area you'll spend, it's heavily mestizos and indigenous groups. One of the culture shocks, if you want to say, that people do tend to see is that when they get there, many of the locals tend to wear traditional wear as opposed to like modern 21st century clothing. You're more likely to see indigenous types of skirts and types of clothing along this line as opposed to like say jeans and a sports jacket. You do see that, but again, it's very common to see this indigenous wear, both women and men. Very common also very large scale hats. And I'm going to mention this briefly in a little bit, but it's usually particularly to help them protect against the sun. To touch back a little bit about the beginning about this skewed imagery, is that Peru is considered a middle income country. Now, what does it mean? Well, basically, it's not the richest, but it's not the poorest country in Latin America. It's true the country has grown economically the last few decades, particularly since the mid-1990s. But the population, you still have a large-scale poverty population. And in the outskirts of the major cities, including in Cusco and particularly in Lima, you will see what they call pueblos jóvenes. Pueblos jóvenes are their versions of shanty towns. Some of these areas do not have running water. Many do not have electricity or modern day conveniences. What you also see, and you can see this particularly in Cusco, is the issue of begging. Both older people and younger people selling on the streets. It's in many ways, you can actually see that if you look in South Florida as well, where people particularly on corner streets will sell like water or flowers to you. There you will see sometimes children and older people. One thing that you see a lot of, particularly teenagers, and you'll see this particularly if you go to the main squares, because Cusco is a tourist center. There's a lot of tourists in Cusco, more so than any other city in the country, percentage-wise even more than Lima, because of its center as well known as the Incan capital, the Incas back in the day. And you will see a lot of tourists. That's the other thing, is particularly if you're going to go in June, July, and August, you'll see a lot of tourists, particularly from North America and Europe. This also attracts, a lot of people to move to Cusco to sell items or get into the tourist trade, which is the dominant industry in Cusco. I mean, Cusco is considered by some estimates one of the 2 or 3 most visited cities in the continent of South America. But you'll see sometimes, particularly in certain squares, particularly teenagers, particularly for shining shoes. Shoe shining is a very big industry, particularly for little poorer populations. I have actually a great grandfather himself. He did this when he was young. Now, this doesn't mean that the country obviously needs to be avoided. It's just that you have to understand is that you will notice poverty. They're much more, imagery-wise as opposed to some other country. One thing to note is about the poverty levels. It has decreased. Even just 2 decades ago, about 50% of the country was considered poor. Now it's roughly less than 30%. The economic changes can also be seen in Cusco itself. I mean, Cusco is like a dichotomy. It's split. It's both an older city, which is where around the main square in the main tourist sites. A lot of the hotels, a lot of the cathedrals are in this older area. Smaller houses. Some of them don't actually have, Wi-Fi, should we say. Internet might be a little bit more sporadic, but you also will have a more modern city, which you'll see, particularly when you travel from Cusco's airport to wherever you'll be staying. Cusco itself is actually a World Heritage Site. It's been designated that since the 1970s. And as a result of that, and also the fact that, and I do want to mention this though, it doesn't happen that often, very rarely in the case of Cusco, is that the city is located in South America. The Andes is home to earthquakes. It doesn't happen that often in Cusco, but because of the World Heritage Site and because of the earthquake preventions, you won't see like, say, modern skyscrapers that you'll see like in some other cities. When I sometimes do presentations on Cusco and I show images, and you'll see some of these images, that's one of the things that people notice, like, oh, it's a lot of like lower level buildings, and it's mainly due to the site as a World Heritage Site to protect the architecture. And I mentioned it previously, but culture shock does happen. And I know your study packet does mention culture shock. Again, culture shock is, seeing things that you're not used to. For example, Spanish is the official language of Peru and the dominant language. However, in areas such as Cusco, you also hear a lot of people speak an indigenous language. It's called Quechua, which is spoken by about 10 million people in South America. It's the language that the Incas spoke. You may have heard of it before, you may have not, but there's certain words I definitely which come from Quechua, including the word puma, as well as, you may have heard of and you may see them as well in your trips, llamas and alpacas, these indigenous animals to the Andes. Their names come from Quechua. Another good example, Quechua word mama, which we now use nowadays for another way for mother. It's the Quechua word for mother. You can also see this in Cusco, and I also like mentioning this because sometimes tourists notice this and they think it a little differently, that the official flag of Cusco is actually the Incan flag. It's called the Tahuantinsuyo flag. It's a checkerboard rainbow color. And sometimes when people visit it, they think it looks very similar to the Gay Pride Parade, actually. The Gay Pride flag, but it's actually the Incan Pride. And you'll see it a lot. Even more recently, within the last couple decades, people have heavily focused more so on the Quechua pronunciation and the Quechua spelling of Cusco. Now, if you grew up here in the United States, in English, people tend to spell Cusco with a C-U-Z-C-O. In Spanish and Portuguese and French, they say C-U-S-C-O. Now, in Quechua, they spell it Q-O-S-Q-O, usually with an apostrophe in the middle. But it's pronounced Cusco, so it's almost the same. The other thing is about the Spanish that's also spoken in Cusco. And again, if you speak Spanish, you will notice this as well, is that the Spanish spoken there is a little different than that spoken in Mexico or Central America or the Caribbean. There's a lot less emphasis in slang. People tend to be more soft-spoken. This sometimes does have an issue for certain people that come from areas where you're used to, loud, boastful. The Caribbean people tend to be a little bit more boastful, happy. The Spanish spoken in the Andes, not just in Cusco, not just in Peru, but Ecuador and parts of Colombia as well, tend to be more soft-spoken. This is actually interesting enough why places like Quito and Ecuador, Cusco, also very popular for people who want to learn Spanish, because people tend to pronounce more so the words because there's less slang. But again, people tend to be soft-spoken. Again, sometimes people think that means they're being rude, but not really. It's just that they're used to speaking softer tones and they're not as forceful. And another key thing to also pay attention to Cusco, and you'll notice that if any of you have ever visited mountains before, is that since Cusco is in the mountains, you will likely suffer for the first couple days. It's the locals call it soroche. It's Quechua for what we call in English high altitude sickness. If you ever been to Colorado or really like places in Mexico, you feel this high altitude areas. And I always recommend to take it slow for the first 24 hours to 36 hours. So the first 2 days when you arrive, you have to understand we're not supermen. I myself always have to take it slow if I'm going to travel in the Andes. If I'm going to go there for work, I make sure not to schedule work the first 2 days, so I can help myself to get more acclimatized to the altitude. You just want to keep it slow, and also try to avoid certain types of food. Now, many of you'll probably be staying with families that host international students are used to this as well, because the key thing is you don't want to avoid fried foods, and you want to avoid particularly alcohol for the first few days because it can hurt you. Another good example related to this that also showcases how Peru is a mid-level country. Like most countries in Latin America, never drink the water from the tap. This is something that people sometimes forget, particularly if you're raised in the United States. We're raised here in the United States, we're raised in Canada, Europe, you're used to you can just drink water from the faucet. You don't want to do that, mainly because of the local bacteria your body's not accustomed to. I mean, bottled water is always the way to go. There's also boiled water, which is interesting as well. Because of the elevation, it actually takes longer for water to boil. It's actually fascinating. If you ever have a chance, take a look at it. It'll take 2 to 3 times longer for water to boil there than it does, say here, particularly in South Florida and Miami, which is at sea level. Again, since you're living with family, many families are accustomed to this. And it's not just to be careful with alcoholic beverages, you also want to be careful with high caffeinated level drinks. And another thing that's also a culture shock, and I notice people see this particularly because since you're likely to be there in what we call summer here, Peru is in the southern hemisphere. As a result, the seasons are opposite of what they are here. For example, July and August are the coldest months of the year in Cusco. It's the equivalent of what we have here in January and February. Now, it doesn't snow in Cusco, but the temperatures can get down to the 40s and 30s sometimes, particularly at night. Many Peruvians in the Andean region, as a result, they tend to wear clothing made out of alpaca wool. It's a thick wool. Sweaters are very common. I always suggest if you have a sweater, bring 1 or 2. If you don't, you can easily get a sweater that's not that expensive when you're down there. And it's actually a very nice souvenir to bring with you to come home because of the alpaca wool. It's not something you really see, particularly if you live in Florida. The only times you really will see alpacas here in Florida is if you go to the zoo. There you'll see, again, alpaca wool. This is also a big thing that I've noticed, that particularly due to the rise of social media, internet, that a lot of people know about Peru is the food. Peruvian food has become, very popular. There's a lot of Peruvian restaurants in the United States, and Peruvian food is a fusion. Again, a lot of indigenous, but also European, African, and Asian cultures. The country has become sort of like a tourist site for Peruvian food. People will go to Peru just to eat. For those who have access to Netflix, there's a show you can watch. It's called Chef's Table. There's an episode in season 3 that is actually only on a Peruvian chef. If you want to know a little bit more about, modern day Peruvian cuisine, it's a very interesting episode to watch. His name is Vicente Martinez. His restaurant, which is actually in Lima, is considered the best restaurant in Latin America. It's called Central. Lima is the center for this foodie push, but you also will see it in Cusco. And now the thing is that if you know anything about Peruvian food, probably the dish you probably know most is called ceviche. Ceviche is raw marinated fish. You won't see this too much in Cusco. That's, again, a coastal dish. In Andes, your diet and foods that you'll see that you'll eat tend to be a little bit more starchy. Potatoes, yuca, corn. A lot of them heavily made into soups and stews due to the climate, to the colder temperatures. There is food I highly recommend. It's called choclo, Choclo. It's a Peruvian-style corn. It's different than the corn you're used to here in the United States or here in North America. It's the kernel. It's kernels are a lot bigger. People tend to eat it as a side and a snack. Now, meat's common in the Andes. Now, some of it is, you will find beef in a lot of places, but actually what's actually tend to be very popular is alpaca meat, which actually tastes very similar to deer, and if you have a chance, try it. It's actually very good. It's actually very high in protein. Rabbit is also popular in this region. And another food that's interesting, but you won't find this everywhere. You have to find specific cuisines and restaurants that serve it. And it's one that is a culture shock by a lot of people, but it's particularly eaten throughout the Andes from Colombia down to Chile. The locals call it cuy. In English, you know it as guinea pig. Now, many of you think of guinea pigs as like these cute little animals that you buy in the pet store. Guinea pigs down in Peru, they tend to be bigger than rabbits. They taste like rabbit as well. And I will admit, I have actually had it a few times myself. In another culture shock, one of the last things I do want to mention is you'll notice this both in the colonial and the modern, that you'll see a lot of these old buildings, but you see a culture shock that you'll find like a McDonald's or a Starbucks in them. There is McDonald's, there's Starbucks, there's KFC in Cusco. They're not like, savages, if you want to say. You'll see this, and people are culture shocked that you'll see like a McDonald's or a Starbucks in a colonial building. But you'll see this also hotels. There's a Marriott and a couple other international hotel chains. In the modern section of the city, you'll see a little bit more modern type of shopping. There's the central markets. You have the local markets where they sell, fruits, vegetables, and clothing. But there's also a modern shopping center that in Cusco, there's only one. It's called Real Plaza. It looks like something out of like a typical U.S. mall. You'll see Chili's, and last time I checked, they've opened newer stuff. There's actually Popeyes, as locals call it, Popeyes. This little information session was sort of to introduce you to some of the aspects about what Peru is about, what you will come across, both positive and negatively. I really hope you take advantage of this study abroad program. I believe heavily in study abroad programs. I believe students should take advantage as well. I myself, when I was a student, I did 3-4 study abroads myself. And I love doing study abroads. But the thing is that Peru is one of those countries not as many people take a look at a study abroad. So I hope you'll take advantage of this study abroad program. And I hope this info was interesting, and I hope you learned a little bit more. And I hope it got you even a little bit more excited to learn a little bit more about the country. And I hope your experience is positive and you come back with a little bit more growth, a little bit more interest as well. So I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for your time.